Oh, hi everyone. Ooh, it sounds really loud. Okay, I'm going to be talking today about diasporic space in London. So I'm really glad that yesterday, there was a discussion about the sort of blurry line between the informal and the formal. I'm particularly talking about how informality happens in the space of a street and maybe in sort of interior spaces that kind of make connections between London and other places, or, so really talking about what diasporic space is. This research is based actually just on one street in London. So if anybody knows London, it's in the northeast of London in the borough of Hackney. And it's an area where there's a lot of Turkish and Kurdish community groups, lots of kind of shops and cafes from both those community groups and community groups living there. As you can see, the shop with the orange shop front is it's called a kahve, the word for coffee in Turkish, and there are a lot of these on that street, which are kind of places where Turkish and Kurdish men meet, and they're actually places which are very sort of exclusively regional, and they're really important in the lives of these people. So these were one of the places that I looked at in my research. But this street sort of runs north to south through London, and it's a kind of artery, and this was the main space of my research. And also, at that time, which was sort of 5-6 years ago when I started this work, it was just before the London Olympics were, London got the Olympics. And so at that time, the street was very much a space where regular protests happened by Kurdish groups against events in Turkey. So this particular one is about the release of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the PKK leader. Now the street is very different. It's been very gentrified, and these sorts of places that I'm going to talk about have, moved on to other places. So it was a very kind of, it was a particular moment in that area, and it's now changed. So I'm particularly thinking about how sort of the idea of a diasporic home is constructed within that street, and so looking at these kahves like this one. The time when I started this research, somebody said to me, oh, if you map all the kahve on the street, it will kind of make almost a perfect map of Turkey. And that's because all of these little spaces have, either through their names or often through football clubs or other sort of other signs, they have very particular regional affiliations. Either the person who lives there, who runs the place, or the people who frequent it are from a particular village or a particular space in Turkey. And so I started sort of looking at this and trying to sort of map the particular spaces in Turkey that these, and elsewhere, where these places were kind of making connections to. And I'll just go through this quickly. And then finally, this is kind of the map of the street. So the greys are all the buildings. And then on top of it, this is a map of Turkey sort of skewed according to the sort of regional affiliations of these different places. And it was a kind of way of trying to think about what this other geography is that is layered on top of the space of the street that, somebody like me who's not part of those two communities probably just walks by and doesn't even notice. But for others, it might be very important. And it actually regulates where you can or can't go, because Kurdish people can't go into certain places that are run by Turkish people, and vice versa. Others, of course, sort of sit in between. So a lot of my research is very much about trying to sort of work out how you might represent this kind of other type of space, which could be informal. So how you map kind of subjectivities, politics, through kind of normal sort of architectural representation. And then I also kind of went in and sort of spoke to some of the people who run these places and really tried to work out what, these places that, like this one called Besiktas, they look very sort of nondescript. There's nothing particularly special about them, but then why were they so important within the lives of the people who were using them? So they're highly gendered spaces, so only really men go there. If there are women there, they're there in order to sort of, as waitresses. But the way these spaces work is through sort of being a kind of node within a series of translocal connections. So somehow space kind of folds in on itself and folds back out again. A lot of sort of say, sort of native English people would consider these places to be incredibly introverted, but actually they're kind of making connections elsewhere. And this is something that I was trying to show in this particular drawing, which is about, I mean, it's looking a little bit at the way Bruno Latour sort of talks about space, you know, so the question, if you can read it, is how is the state of the affairs of the Cave maintained? And it was through kind of a series of different connections that were being made, which are kind of somehow color-coded here, so through technology, through certain types of social interactions, but also kind of particular sort of rituals and gestures that kind of make this space, and kind of political affiliation. So this particular space, you know, the person who ran it was very much part of the workers' movement in Turkey, so he had connections to the Tuzla shipyard and the kind of protests that were going on there, and he was making connections with workers in London as well. And then, as I said, certain things about sort of the way people use certain rituals and gestures. So seed eating, you know, certain card games being played, etc. So there was a kind of series of work that I did here in these spaces, kind of looking at how they worked, and some were very familiar spaces. So, you know, men brought their sons, and grandfathers sort of were there, but others were very much, you know, only sort of a certain age group between sort of 20 to 30-year-olds sort of went there. And then the other sort of thing I was doing on the same street again, I was also started to look at how the actual space of the street was being used as well, and how it was being used, as I said, as a space of protest, but also a place where kind of different types of diasporic territories were overlapping. So people were kind of claiming certain spaces, and it was, you know, a certain kind of occupation of space was occurring. So I started this bit of research off first by just doing lots of kind of interviews with different people about kind of how they got to London, you know, what kind of political subjectivities we were talking about. This particular one is really interesting. So I asked people to draw Kurdistan, basically. So a lot of these people were from either Turkey or Kurdish areas of the various sort of countries involved. And this one was really interesting because the woman I spoke to sort of drew a circle first, which was Kurdistan, and then she drew the kind of boundaries of all the other countries that were involved. And she was the only one who did that because she had lived in the Kurdish areas of all these spaces, whereas in contrast to her, this particular drawing was done by a very young Turkish man who, for him to draw Kurdistan was impossible, so he kind of drew Turkey, and his version of this was kind of the first Gulf War and the narrative of it. So somehow these drawings are kind of showing the sort of particular political situation that's transposing itself onto the street in London and is kind of being played out in those spaces. And then just to give a little bit of background, this was the context that that street was in, which, as I said, the London Olympics were about to happen, and there was this kind of extreme development pressure, and these kinds of maps were being made of the area. So, you know, these developmental plans in which, you know, there is no sign of these spaces that I've been talking about. And these were the plans that were being brought to the planning table, as it were, and these were the ones that were being used to sort of discuss to do participation and to consult on these plans that were anyway going to go ahead, sort of thing. And so the next set of sort of drawings I'm going to show you are sort of my attempt, I guess, to try to sort of map these kind of diasporic territories that I'm talking about, people walking through these streets and kind of this layering of different types of spaces. And those maps are somehow done in opposition to these kinds of maps, which are, you know, sort of very, you know, they take a lot of the information away. So I started off just going for walks along that road. This particular walk is with the woman who organized many of the protests that I was talking about. So it was just, you know, just walking with her and asking her which kind of shops and services she used, where she went, you know, who she spoke to, that sort of thing. When did she use these spaces? So very much about her kind of life on that street. And then one of the things that I wanted to think about was how kind of you could represent territory. You know, territory, I was sort of using Deleuze and Guattari's concept of territory, you know, this idea that it's both biological and political, so it's about kind of personal space, you know, where you feel comfortable going, who you are, you know, effects where you can go in the end, and how you might represent that, you know, both temporally, spatially, and also, you know, how do you actually present sort of political subjectivity, and how do you show this kind of very blurry line. So I did this work with a computational designer, and we used what's called an artificial neural network, which is, so we took this as the raw data for the mapping, and we used this particular way of mapping, which is a map that is just a relation. So the next drawing is a bit strange. I mean, this isn't the final drawing we did, but this is a moment that we passed through, which is kind of taking some of that, those representations, that are just some of that data from the walk, and trying to sort of encode it in a computer, and trying to think about how you put time, space, and these kind of other stories into the map. So this was one thing we did, and then we sort of changed the representation and kind of tried to look at that occupation of the street as a kind of almost a 3D sort of point cloud that then became, what do you call it, like a 3D sort of volume that is layered, and the layering kind of talks about intensities of occupation and use. So where the green is very dark is a lot of activity is happening, and where it's kind of pale, you know, there's not so much happening, and then there's kind of separations between them. So that's the kind of close-up. And then finally, I mean, this was very much playing with sort of architectural representation. So finally, we did a kind of representation that looked through this in sections, so through the street, and I'll just show you a video of it. There it is. So this is almost like somebody walking down the street. Just go back. So somebody walking down the street, so the elevation of the street is a kind of navigational device, and as you move your mouse up and down, you're kind of walking down the street. The black sort of, that's slightly hidden, the black line is showing the elevation of the street, so it's kind of a building, pavement street, a building. And at certain moments where something interesting is happening, the kind of story is put back into the map, and this is kind of the temporal bit. So on this shows time on one side of the street and this on the other. And then, yeah, as I say, at certain moments we're kind of putting this, the story back. And the idea really was to kind of show the street very differently from those other maps, to show that, you know, it is this kind of series of occupation and use. It's kind of, it's a representation that is sort of showing the street as, you know, very, very much about how you occupy it, rather than the building itself. The building is just a kind of line, and it's the occupation that's really important. And so it was somehow trying to blur the line of what is the space that the architect uses. So yeah, yeah, I could stop there, but so this was what the work was about. It was trying to sort of, often in sort of participatory work, at least for architects, you know, the drawings that we do are kind of very sort of almost childlike in some sense. And then part of that, the reason for doing that, of course, is, you know, you can do it quickly and it's more readable with the people who you're kind of working with. But especially in the context in which I was working in London, a lot of the maps that were being made were made by kind of groups like Space Syntax, who sort of do these sort of drawings about kind of the use of space on a street, you know, and where people move through the street. And at that moment, when those drawings are brought to the planning table, they have such confidence that nobody can question them in the end, because they take qualitative information and make it concrete. And somehow this was kind of, you know, in opposition to that, and so sort of showing participatory work that had a similar sense of kind of technical ability, I guess, but was showing, you know, a very different world. So, yeah, thank you.